I got a message from Dick Wickline, a longtime Jefferson basketball coach, also coached at Falls Church in West Springfield and other places, because he had some state programs, high school basketball programs he wanted me to have. And I was blessed, so much great information in there. So couldn't wait to meet him. So we met at IHOP near Kingstown. And, I didn't know Coach Wickline at all. I had refereed his games when he was at West Springfield, and I had played against him in '84 when he had a team that made a run to the regional tournament and got to the Final Four in 1984 with Curve and Dennis. And so it was great. But I never met him, didn't know what to expect. So we sat down, and the first thing Coach did was thank me for the time I put in on Nova Legends. He said that he mentioned David Houston had a couple teams that had played so well. And, from high school kids that play basketball, the memories are so important. And that the Nova Legends group is helping people keep those memories and how special it's been. And obviously, coaches like Dick McKinley and Thompson and Coach Bird and all the others that have participated, Coach Thompson, they're a big part of what we're doing, because they give us credibility, and we're here because of their sacrifices that they made. But it was a great opportunity for me to get to know Coach Wickline, and because I know he has a lot of perspective of the game and the history that's gone on over the last 70 years. Coach Wickline is from Alderson, West Virginia, which is in the southern part of the state, not too far from Lexington, Virginia, across the border into West Virginia, which is basketball country. It's also not that far from where Red Jenkins is from. And I asked him if basketball was big in his area, and he said it was huge. Many of the counties had 10, 15 little high schools in the county, and the high school basketball there was very important to the culture. Told kind of a funny story that recently he was reading that a JV team and JV programs of one county had been eliminated. And it was a big deal, causing a huge uproar. Turns out it was a JV team of elementary schools. It just tells you how important basketball is where he's from. Those schools all started to consolidate into bigger schools, obviously, over time. Coach Wickline's father was a railroad worker, and there was very little work during World War II for him. So he moved his family to Washington, D.C. in Northern Virginia, and got a job in a torpedo factory. And that's where he worked. And that's where he spent the rest of his life. And he recently passed at age 96. So he had a long run here in Northern Virginia. So Coach ended up going to Annandale, where he played for a coach named John Grinnell. John Grinnell was a lawyer. And obviously most of our coaches are teachers. He was a lawyer, came very well dressed to a game like any proper barrister would. And Coach Wickline modestly said that he was a good player, got that out of him, but he wouldn't have wanted to coach himself. He said he lacked discipline. He also played baseball. He was a starter on the baseball team, and he ended up going to Potomac State, a junior college in West Virginia. There wasn't very many junior colleges near where he was, so they played small four-year colleges like Alderson Broadus and other colleges. And he did well. He averaged 16 points a game, and he felt like he could play at the next level. So he ended up going to George Washington University here in DC, where he played both baseball and basketball. And in basketball, he says, the higher level you get, the more it exposes you. Your weaknesses are exposed the higher level you get. But he did start for George Washington, so obviously he must have done quite well. So he quickly got into coaching, and he said it was something that it was kind of unfortunate in some ways for him, because he got a varsity job very quickly at Falls Church. And I asked him, well, how were you able to get a varsity job? And he said it wasn't a job that a lot of people really wanted. They had losing seasons there, and when those jobs came open, not a lot of people applied, and he was able to get the job. And he changed things right away. He just became very organized. In one of my earlier podcasts, Charlie Thompson had said about Coach Wickline, he's one of the most organized guys that he's met, and that's what he did. He just opened the gyms. He allowed the kids to play more, and that was a problem. The kids didn't have anywhere to play. And he encouraged the George Mason kids, the old George Mason High School, which is now Meridian High School, to play with them. So a lot of pickup, One of the players from George Mason that would play with his kids is Gerald Byrd. Obviously, Gerald Byrd started at the African American school, Luther Jackson out in Maryfield, but he ended up playing at George Mason, and he's the younger brother, as we know by now, of Coach Wendell Byrd, who ended up obviously winning multiple regional titles at South Lakes many years later. And Coach Byrd also played at George Mason. So he did really well. One of the first players he coached was Charlie Thompson. And I asked him whether Charlie was a good player. Charlie was a very competitive player. And one of his best players was Michael McKinley. Mike McKinley was a player that he knew had a lot of promise, started very, very early in his high school career. But Coach Wickline soon was tempted to go to Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson, which, unbelievable to us, was the new school. And I asked him, well, if things were going well at Falls Church, why would you want to go to Jefferson? At Falls Church, the gym was very small. The facilities weren't great. They had 4 rows of bleachers. They had a stage, and it just wasn't a place to grow a program in his mind. So it was going to be very tempting for him to go to Jefferson, and he eventually took that job. I asked him, since we're talking about Gerald Byrd, he scrimmaged Luther Jackson while he was at Falls Church. He said that he did, and they said they had a player named Woods that was a grown man. But he said the Luther Jackson team wasn't as good as some of their better teams, and they actually beat Luther Jackson. He said the better African American teams at the all black leagues was at Parker Gray. As a matter of fact, even before Earl Lloyd played, and Earl Lloyd was the first amongst the first African American players in the NBA, they had a team that went to Chicago to the national championship. And they were a very good program. But the Luther Jackson team he played against, they beat, and even though they had great players, they had seen better days. One person that he did play against that also had gone to Parker Gray was Coach Jimmy Lewis, who we know as Coach Jimmy Lewis, but back then he was Jimmy Lewis, who played for Parker Gray and then transferred to Groveton, the first Black player to play in Northern Virginia in the integrated leagues. Well, Coach Wickline said one of the challenges he had as a coach, especially in the early days, is mostly on-the-job training. He said maybe he would have been better off as an assistant for one of these great legendary coaches, but that wasn't his experience. And as a example of his lack of experience or maybe lack of know-how, he scheduled that game against Groveton, which was a big matchup at Marshall High School. Marshall had a much better gym, and for a matchup of this magnitude, it was a better place to have it. Well, that took the home court advantage of Falls Church away. That little gym was worth something to that team. So that's a memory he had of Coach Lewis, and him being a coach who trained himself and making a mistake. At TJ, he would really build a program with some great teams. He was there for 23 years. One of the earliest players that he remembers that was tough was this guy named John King. Of course, John King is a member of our group. He's the older brother of Billy King, who was the Defensive Player of the Year in college basketball, former executive of the Philadelphia 76ers. But John was a really tough player. He played at Stewart, a Bailey's Crossroad kid. I also asked him about some of the coaches he coached against, especially in the early days. I mean, obviously, he said if he had to win one game, Charlie Thompson would be the coach that he would pick for one game. And of course, Don McCool's record speaks for himself. He was a great coach. But I asked him to talk about coaches we may not have talked about that much. One guy he mentioned was Mo Levin. Mo Levin coached at Washington and Lee, and he was a very good coach, a great coach, as a matter of fact. Wouldn't always speak, definitely had a certain air about him. And one thing that was memorable about Mo Levin is during timeouts, he'd have the players lie on their stomachs on the floor, facing him all together, and they would look at his clipboard or whatever play he was diagramming. So the players would actually lie in formation, almost like in a circle on the floor, and that's how he would speak to them, which is something he had never seen before. I've never seen it before either. Mo Levin coaching an Arlington team, that's a big city team at those times. Arlington, Wakefield was built in the late 50s. Um, Washington Lee and Wakefield was both like 50, and then I guess Yorktown, but Washington Lee was the power. And the Fairfax County schools were almost considered like country schools. They were smaller and not the powerhouse that Washington Lee was at the time. Washington Lee had the Hummer brothers, John and Ed, both had pro careers, and both were dominant high school players. And they won a state championship in the early 60s with Mo Levin. And also at Wakefield, there was a great coach named Maynard Haithcock, who preceded Jim Vandell there. Another coach we haven't talked about, but Coach Wickline said was a great coach. Some of the other guys he mentioned was Roscoe Dean, which I was interested in hearing about because Roscoe coached at Robinson, where I went to school. And Roscoe was at Lee first and did a great job. He mentioned the unfortunate accident that Roscoe Dean and a coach named Jerry Hannes, great coach at Lee, they died. Jerry Hannes died in a car accident when Coach Dean and Coach Hannes were leaving a coaches meeting many years ago. We also talked about Mike Henson. Mike Henson was a TC Williams coach, won a state championship in 1977, went to state tournament numerous times. Coach Wickline says Coach Henson was not a basketball technician, didn't have a great basketball mind, but he instilled discipline, which is very important at that school. And he was physically imposing. He would physically fight kids. He didn't do so, but he was willing to do so, and the kids knew it. And they were a guy that you had to respect him as a coach and as a person. He also talked about Carl Hensley. Carl Hensley, of course, was a great coach, but he also was a really good guy. I had a lot of respect for him. One of the players we talked about while he was Coach Wickline was at Jefferson. We did talk about the team with Tim Danehauer that played against Albemarle High School. The game that I had talked to Coach McKay about, the Robinson Coach McKay, about when Coach McKay was an assistant at Albemarle, which is in Charlottesville, for a guy named Rich Lyons. Rich Lyons had been a coach at Stewart High School earlier before he went to Charlottesville. Anyway, Albemarle was undefeated, came out 79 to play at Jefferson, and Jefferson beat him soundly. And it was a big matchup, and Coach Wickline has very fond memories of that game. He also coached Kervin Dennis. Kervin Dennis was a four-year starter, class of 86, and is the leading scorer in school history. And also a player named Ray Crittenden. Ray ended up going to Annandale last year because Thomas Jefferson became the science and technology. So the old TJ closed as a school. And Ray Crittenden was a great player. And he had coached against his father, who was a great player in the late 60s and the early days of integrated basketball in Northern Virginia. So Coach Wickline coached at TJ when it became science and technology, but he didn't enjoy it. The players had almost too much academic responsibilities for a basketball coach. They were up till 3 a.m, which made performing some days on the basketball court very difficult. And he became an assistant to Cliff Gates. One team he did mention under Coach Gates was a team he said they had a lot of size, including Christopher Lewis, Jim Lewis's son. He said this was a great airport team. It's a phrase I've never heard, but I guess it's a team that's physically imposing, looks great in the airport, and when they come into the gym would really scare people. I don't think the team did so well though. From there, Coach went to St. Stephen's. Sleepy Thompson, a St. Stephen's legend, convinced him to go over to St. Stephen's and coach. And Sleepy Thompson actually died before Coach started, but he had a great run there, went to the private school state tournament 3 times, really enjoyed the travel. They would play teams in Richmond like Benedictine, and they'd travel to different places in Maryland to play. And he thought that was a good time. And then he ended up at West Springfield for 13 years. And he just loved the kids at West Springfield, really good kids, good families. Had some success there. Really enjoyed coaching with David Halston. David is the present coach at West Potomac. So David was a fantastic player. I played at Coppin State, the Division I school. It was a great hire. He met David on an interview, didn't know him. I met him, impressed, and just a great coach to work with. That made the West Springfield gig even that much more memorable. In 2010, he retired from coaching And I asked him, did he coach other sports in his career? And he also coached softball. He was a varsity coach for many years and had success and loved it. Matter of fact, he has a Facebook group of his ex-softball players, and it's been very successful. And he also coached football, and I believe he coached even baseball on JV or freshman. He encouraged me to interview, I guess, Tom Verbanek, who was a football coach, and also Mark Travis. But Verbanek was one of the crew that Francis Dahl, legendary coach at Lake Braddock, and I think later Westfield. There's also activities director at Westfield, I believe. But he brought up from the Charlottesville area, and is just a great coach, and told me he'd be a great interview, and Mark Travis would be as well. And then we kind of wrapped up our breakfast, and he talked about what makes a great coach. And he visualized a pie chart, and he had talked to former Annandale coach Jack White about this pie chart. And Coach White had said coaching was 60%. Success in coaching is 60% coaching, 30% talent, and 10% the situation you're in. And Coach Wickline doesn't believe that. He says most of coaching in his mind is the situation you're in. He says if you're coaching softball and baseball in the Vienna area, you have those great feeder programs into your schools, you're going to be a successful coach. He says at West Springfield, it was a great soccer and baseball area in terms of little leagues. And he says that gives you the heads up. He thinks that the situation is more important than even talent and coaching, even though I'm sure the talent is somehow related to the situation you're in. As we were leaving, he also to make his point even stronger, he mentioned Coach Hardage. Coach Hardage was a legendary football coach at Annandale, and I guess he took over for Coach Henry in the late 60s, and he coached into the early 80s, and he had great success, won at least a couple state championships for Annandale. But later, when he went to Flint Hill and Bishop Ireton, he had no success. And Coach Wickline was like, was he not a great coach anymore? No, the situation there was very different and very hard to win. And finally, we went to his car and we got the programs that was the reason that we were going to meet up. And he went through this treasure trove of state programs and 40 or 50 years of it. And I have some of the later years, but there were so many gaps. And to me, you could not give me a better present. And he opened it up and took out the first program. It was 1960. And it was in Richmond Arena where the Richmond team played, University of Richmond played. It was an old repair facility that had been turned over. And he had vivid memories of him watching his first state game with Washington Lee and one of the Hummer brothers. Hey, this is a gift to you. I was going to give this back to the Virginia High School League, but I know you're making good use to it. And this was in support of your group. Anyway, it was a great breakfast. And I know that Coach probably wouldn't have done this interview on a podcast like some of the other coaches, but I wanted to make sure I got all this great material, on YouTube for perpetuity, because Coach Wickline, great coach, great person. And I was so glad to meet him, and I'm really appreciative of the time that he gave me.